Hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to our second edition of Breaking News for this Friday, the 5th day of December, 2025. And as always, we have more important stories to look at in this edition of Breaking News, so let's get right to them. First of all, from Breitbart, Donald Trump warns Europe faces civilizational erasure with the EU and unrestricted mass migration to blame. And then we have a story from the Jerusalem Post, not surprising, that Iran holds drills in the Gulf, firing ballistic cruise missiles at simulated targets. Fighting again with them is not far off, that's for sure. From the Times of Israel, set for a U.S. trip, Netanyahu faces tough sledding as Trump cools on aggressive stance. Then finally, from Newsmax, Vance downplays anti-Semitism on the right, putting him at odds with Ted Cruz pro-Israel groups. Each of these stories continues to confirm the biblical picture of the last days. All right, let's get into it. First of all, headline number one, Donald Trump warns Europe faces civilization erasure with the EU and unrestricted mass migration is to blame. A Breitbart story. This is driven by the hapless EU, the civilization erasure, and unrestricted mass migration. This is what Europe is facing, Donald Trump warns. This is Thursday in a new strategy document that he put out. The warning of looming total cultural dissipation in Europe is made in the U.S. national security strategy. It notes Europe has economic problems, but says they are eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilization erasure within a generation. The Trump administration made its fears clear in a 33-page document released overnight. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition, creating birth rates and the loss of national identities and self-confidence. A formal national security strategy is typically released by presidents once each term. It can form a framework for future policies and budgets, as well as signaling to the world where the U.S. president's priorities lies. This is support from the BBC. The new document follows similar themes in Trump's speeches to the United Nations, to his speech to the United Nations earlier this year, where he had harsh criticism, if you recall, for Western Europe and its approach to migration and embrace of open borders along with the UN. He warned them that unrestricted mass migration is sending Western nations to hell, along with their individual cultural identities. The new report doubles down on Trump's point of view, calling for the restoration of Western identity, combating foreign influence, ending mass migration, and focusing more on broader U.S. priorities such as stopping drug cartels. Focusing on Europe, it asserts if current trends continue, the continent and its economic issues are, quote, eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilization erasure. Then he says it's far from obvious whether European communities will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies, the document states. Now, Trump is definitely on point with this statement. The globalist view that engulfs Europe is setting the stage perfectly for the final Antichrist. And see our book 25 Signs, we're near the end, signs 12 through 14 that deal with this. Sign 12, there'll be a 10-nation confederation in Western Europe in the last days, the revival of the ancient Roman Empire. Sign 13, there will be a one world political and economic system in that time called globalism. And then sign 14, the world will desperately look for a leader. Also, see our book, The Final Antichrist, The Coming Caesar. All these books are free downloads from our website, Educating Our World, and they're all under the heading of Bible prophecy. All right, so quite a harsh reality with Europe, and he tells it like it is. And this is where Europe is heading. We know that from Scripture, with it being like one great globalistic system where the people really have no say so. You've got the haves and the have-nots, and the haves, the few that are basically lording over the have-nots, and then you have a person who comes on the scene, the final Antichrist, who will lord over all of them. All right. Headline number two, Iran holds drills in the Gulf, firing ballistic missiles, cruise missiles at simulated targets. This is from the Jerusalem Post. State media reported a massive launch of Qatar 110, Qatar 380, and Qatar 360 cruise missiles and 303 ballistic missiles at targets in the Gulf of Oman. Iran's Revolutionary Guards Navy fired these ballistic and cruise missiles at simulated targets in the Gulf on Friday during a two-day military exercise aimed at countering foreign threats, the state media reported. Earlier, Iran hosted an anti-terrorism drill in its northwestern province of East Azerbaijan with members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, according to the state press TV, was intended to signal both peace and friendship with neighboring states and warn enemies that any miscalculation would meet a decisive response. So here they go again. The ground and naval exercises follow a 12-day air war, as we've talked about before, as you know very well, between Israel and Iran in June, during which the U.S. joined Israel in striking Iran's nuclear facilities. State media reported the massive launch of these cruise missiles and ballistic missiles targets. The drones simultaneously struck simulated enemy bases, the report said. The IRGC, that's the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, began its exercise in the strategic Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman on Thursday. All right, what's our take on this? Well, very simple. It's only a matter of time until the fighting resumes with Iran. And as we've said many times, Iran will have to be neutered to a degree where it will not be the big threat to Israel in the Middle East with its surrogates. That is going to come from Russia sometime later, not from Iran. So if Iran attacks Israel, again, like before, it is not the Ezekiel 38-39 invasion. That one is led by Russia, with Iran and Turkey being surrogates. And that's not going to happen for quite a while yet because the players just aren't in place for that to happen. Like we said, there's 5 things that need to happen before that can occur that are just not in place right now. All right, headline number 3, set for U.S. trip. Netanyahu faces tough sledding as Trump cools on aggressive stance. It's in the Times of Israel. The prime minister is likely seeking to bring the White House focus back to the hawkish wish list on Gaza, Lebanon, and beyond. That's Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course. But Trump could use pardon leverage to push a more peaceful approach. Now, this is really interesting, this editorial here, or this observation they have. It appears that Prime Minister Netanyahu is headed back to the U.S. this month for his 5th visit since President Trump returned to the White House in January, and his first since the ceasefire went into effect in Gaza. Trump himself hasn't confirmed the trip or even the invitation, but Netanyahu's office put out a statement this week saying the president invited Netanyahu back to the U.S. in the near future, and an Israeli official told the Times of Israel that the trip would likely come days after the Christmas holiday, potentially at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. The mood was certainly festive last time when they met, wasn't it, in Israel on October 13th, hours before the Simchat Torah holiday. A ceasefire taken place in Gaza. All 20 living hostages were back in Israel, and Middle Eastern leaders had banded together to back Trump's plan to disarm and remove Hamas. Well, here's the real worry. Trump shutting down Netanyahu's necessary military options to rid Hamas of their weapons. Only time will tell, and that's what we keep repeating. As we had the story earlier today, had a story yesterday and the day before, they're worried on the Israeli side that Trump will not allow Israel to do what needs to get done, and Hamas will not be disarmed. They'll still be next door to do October 7th all over again sometime in the future. All right, finally, headline number 4, another worry here. Vance downplays anti-Semitism on the right, putting him at odds with Ted Cruz and pro-Israel groups. This is from Newsmax. Vice President J.D. Vance is forcefully rejecting warnings from within his own party about rising anti-Semitism on the political right, placing himself in direct contrast with Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, and other Republicans who say the threat is real and growing. In a wide-ranging interview with NBC News, Vance dismissed the idea that anti-Semitic sentiment is worsening among conservatives, insisting the accusations of a broader problem amount to slanderous attacks on the GOP. But his comments come at a moment when high-profile conservatives, online influencers, and parts of the populist right, many of them close to Vance, have embraced rhetoric that alarms Jewish leaders, traditional Republicans, and even fellow Trump administration officials. The divide between Vance and Cruz underscores a deeper ideological realignment in the party over Israel, foreign policy, and the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. Vance told NBC News that he simply does not see anti-Semitism spreading among young conservatives, despite mounting incidents nationally. When I talk to young conservatives, I don't see some simmering anti-Semitism that's exploding, Vance said. In any bunch of apples, you have bad people, but it's slanderous to say the Republican Party is extremely anti-Semitic. The vice president framed the issue as one of personal conduct rather than systemic concern, emphasizing that judging others based on immutable characteristics is unchristian and un-American. Oh, he's right on that. It certainly is. But his assurance that anti-Semitism is not meaningfully rising on the right places him at odds with Republicans who have sounded the alarm. Ted Cruz, positioning himself as a potential 2028 rival to Vance, has increasingly used his platform to highlight what he calls a worrisome uptick in anti-Jewish sentiment among conservatives. Well, our response is this: the anti Semitism is definitely there and it is growing. Vance is not a strong supporter of Israel, which would be detrimental to the United States if he's elected in 2028. Of course, if Newsom is elected, he's probably the candidate we assume who the Democrats have put forward. Then God help us. All right, the good news is we all know how this is going to end someday. See our book, look up a timeline of 50 last days events for the biblical picture. But until then, we just don't know what's going to happen day by day. And we report it here, but it all fits within the pattern of what the Lord says we should expect. So we're not disillusioned. We're not discouraged. We know the Lord's working right on his time, right on his schedule. And we'll keep an eye on these events for you and bring you the latest. I'm Don Stewart. Again, thanks for watching. Until tomorrow, when we do another edition of Breaking News, may the Lord richly, richly bless you.